Welcome to another edition of AML Conversations. I'm your host today, John Byrne, and with me today, it's a real pleasure to have Jonathan Rusch. John is the director of the U.S. and International Anti-Corruption Law Program. He's an adjunct professor at American University's Washington College of Law. I've known John for decades. He spent over 27 years, I believe, at the Justice Department, worked in the private sector, and has been a professor for quite a long period of time. And while he is involved in a whole host of issues that reference money laundering, one of his key focuses has been on anti-corruption. And so that's what we want to talk to him about today, talk to John about today. So John, first of all, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Not at all, John. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
So let's start off sort of setting the stage of where we are in 2026, recording this right before the 4th of July and 250 years of America, and obviously should be a very positive thing, and it is for many people, all of us to some degree. But the area of corruption has really become front and center, not just in the U.S., but certainly globally. And I know that's something that you focus on. But let's first talk about your take as a former DOJ lawyer and someone who's been in this space as long as you have, your take on what's happening within this administration regarding corruption, bribery, grift, whatever you want to call it, from a legal perspective.
Okay. I guess there are a couple of things, John, that I'd say at the outset. First of all, from the very beginning of this second Trump administration, it's been clear that the Department of Justice, from the top down, has focused on eliminating or at least drastically reducing the authority and by extension, the expertise of prosecutors of the Justice Department who have experience in dealing with corruption issues. It's not just that they eliminated altogether, with one or two exceptions, entire units that focused on issues that could pertain to corruption, like the public integrity section of the criminal division of the Justice Department, but also completely eliminating other components designed to focus on going after kleptocratic assets of Russia and other countries, completely eliminating mechanisms and sources of expertise that have been there for years and years. I think if you were to look scrupulously through every day's posts by the Department of Justice, you will find here and there occasional cases where the Department of Justice is bringing public related cases. I mean, people dealing with, or cases dealing with public officials who have engaged in some kind of corrupt behavior. But I think they are much fewer and farther between than they were in multiple prior administrations. And unfortunately, as I think we've also seen, this president has seen fit to use the pardoning power, not only as he did in the first administration, to pardon people in various, shall we say, support groups or groups favoring his point of view on things, like pardoning massively people connected with the January 6th, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol, but also increasingly in this administration, people who are already clearly convicted of bribery and corruption offenses. Now, when I think back through constitutional history a little bit, I remember that Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers that he referred to the pardon power as a benign prerogative. Right. And that's sort of an interesting take on this, considering how much Americans wanted to dissociate themselves from the king, from the British government, and so on. And yet they carried over a pardoning power because I think they saw there was an appropriate source of authority for the president. And his reminder, as I think we've all been seeing leading up to the 4th of July, a concept of an office as an executive officer that had no precedent in human history. And yet they saw fit to let him be able to exercise a royal kind of prerogative presumably in selective instances, to provide a measure of relief in extraordinary cases. In this presidency, it has become the norm to pardon or commute the sentences of people who are clearly convicted of mainstream bribery and corruption offenses. And that, I think, sends a very, very troublesome message. It, of course, sends a message to the public in general that the president is happy to favor those who favor his point of view in the world. You know, the Changpeng Zhao pardon is a good example of that, where his company Binance paid $1 billion fine, where he himself went to prison for several months. And yet, with all of those factors, apparently because he is very, very strongly favorable toward crypto in general, that was a case that was seen fit to result in a full pardon. Those kinds of things send messages also, frankly, to the Department of Justice. I think even prosecutors who want to do the right thing, at Main Justice of the U.S. Attorney's Office, now have a very strong signal that you better not pick people who are in some way regarded favorably by this administration, or who have some personal connections to this administration. And all of those factors should be completely outside the worldview of anything having to do with the administration of justice. So on several levels, I think there are great causes for concern about the drastic reduction in the capacity of the Justice Department even to prosecute bribery and corruption cases other than lower level cases, and concerns about whether those prosecutions will be allowed to go forward either during the prosecution or whether they'll in effect be swept aside by an after the fact pardon.
You know, I think generally we understand why anti-corruption is so important, because corruption domestically and globally harms economies. But why don't you talk a bit about why anti-corruption matters? Again, some of it's obvious, for accountability, punishment for convicted activities, that, you know, those sorts of things. But when you look, as you just say, the messaging obviously becomes important. But both here and around the globe, I know experts have talked for years about some of the impacts that perhaps we're not aware of. So if you're talking to students, as you do, and you say the reason why we're going to talk about anti-corruption is because when corruption flourishes, XYZ. What are some of the things in your experience that make it clear, besides it being illegal, that anti-corruption is an important tool?
Sure. So I think I'd probably focus on 4 different categories of adverse effects that corruption can bring to any society. First of all, on the most basic level, if you have corrupt people at the top of a political structure who are openly stealing from the funds of that country's treasury, misallocating funds, in other words, it should be going to public benefit and putting it in their pockets, that has significant economic effects. You know, even if there are programs and practices that people agree in general warrant, you know, some kind of support from government. It could be in any area of regulation. If you're seen to be stealing from your own treasury, or you have people around you who are stealing from their own treasury, that itself has significant dislocation in terms of economic effects. Indirectly, of course, it also raises the cost of engaging in certain transactions. If you know that, for example, your company has an opportunity to get a contract or some kind of a concession from a foreign government, you know in general what the market prices will be for that from your competitors. But then when somebody says, yes, but you need to make sure that I get a commission or some other euphemistic statement for a bribe, you're also increasing the cost to the company, which also has undesirable effects. Then it also, in effect, tells other companies, if you want to do business there, Just be prepared to pay more to get that valuable contract. I think a second category of factors is what I'll say, broadly speaking, is political. That is, when you have, and I think what happened recently in Hungary is a good example of that. When you have a system in which you have a leader of a government, but then others around you who are, because of fidelity to the leader and desire to benefit from whatever largesse he can help to disseminate, if those people help to maintain a system that in effect looks like it's a democratic system, people are being put up for public office, people can vote, but then you do things that skew the ability of honest candidates for public office to compete, and you keep basically reinforcing the same corrupt system, that has the appearance of legitimacy, but in fact operates in ways that further undermine the ability of people in that society to be able to be confident that their vote matters, that they're being listened to, and so on. Which is why I think it's so important for people to keep watching the events in Hungary, because this has been such a dramatic flip after 16 years of Orban's rule, to see that people finally had enough, that there were protests in the streets, there was widespread dissatisfaction with what system Orban and his party, Fidesz, had put in place. But there are many other places around the world, unfortunately, where you have the same kind of corruption at the top that results in this kind of reinforcement of people who continue to benefit illegally from the resources of government and to keep holding on positions of power. I would say a third category might be broadly considered social effects. Now, what I've been talking to you about now is what's called grand corruption. You have corruption at the top of government, or a circle of people around it. But we also have so-called petty corruption. Well, I sometimes disagree with the use of the word petty, because what we're really talking about is corruption that extends all the way down to everyday functions of society. You want to get a permit for some kind of activity for business in your location. No problem. Just pay this extra money to this lower level bureaucrat. And as citizens in multiple countries have reported, this sometimes extends also to, do you need law enforcement to come to your house because you've been robbed or had other bad things happen? Well, if you have to pay police officers just to do their jobs, one, that's undesirable on a principled level, but also I think that tends to undermine people's faith in government institutions. Same is true in some societies where you have to pay a bribe to get medical care because medical care is scarce. And then finally, and I think this is one that's particularly relevant in this country, what I would call the legal effects. You have certain situations, this actually happened last year in Ukraine, where at a certain time, certain political forces decided they wanted to change anti-corruption laws in Ukraine to allow the procurator, as the chief prosecutor, to be able to oversee the work of two other anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, and those latter agencies, were trusted by people. Well, somehow they managed to ram through a change in the laws that resulted in a very vigorous and immediate response by Ukrainians who demonstrated in the streets, and shortly after that, President Zelensky signed an order repealing that. We don't have that kind of rapid response in this country, unfortunately. What we have now is a situation where, as we've seen time and again in many categories of cases that are challenging actions by the administration, federal judges deem that those actions are somehow in violation of law, not authorized or whatever. And in any other administration of the past that I can think of, there might be instances where the government, the administration, the president say, well, we disagree and we're going to pursue this to the courts. I have never recalled instances where you have the level of invective being directed at individual judges, even Supreme Court justices, as was the case in the tariffs case that they decided within the last year. Basically calling them names, calling them rogue judges, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think part of what concerns those of us in the legal profession is the idea that there is, and the acting attorney general himself used the phrase, a war on the judiciary. There is a concerted effort not only to contest different cases, but to undermine the legitimacy of federal judges making these decisions. And despite the fact that there's this sustained surge of invective from the president, from White House spokespersons and others, the judges who are making these decisions at the trial court level, federal district judges, come from multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat, some even including the prior Trump administration. So I think that's one of the areas that I and other lawyers are being very watchful of, looking for instances where, because federal judges can't speak for themselves, they can't speak out to defend their individual decisions or their general approach to these issues. I think it's important that people continue to focus on this sustained effort to engage in disrespect for courts, denigration of judges as a category. And so far, luckily, we've not seen any efforts to try to completely undo the authority of courts to engage in the kind of review that they're supposed to give to government actions in any administration. But if people are attentive to these issues, it's not just the invective. There was an effort some months ago, apparently, within the Department of Justice to canvass U.S. attorneys' offices, basically to look for information that would allow them to forward recommendations for impeachment to the Congress. That kind of attitude, to me, really suggests that there is no institutional respect for the work of the federal judiciary, and instead an effort basically to use any means, any arguments to try to get the federal judiciary sufficiently disrespected and to be regarded as less than even-handed by the public. So I think those four areas, economic, social, political, legal, are all issues that can crop up in any society that has a significant problem with corruption.
Yeah, and they've clearly done the same thing with the media over the past decade, and obviously, in some cases, the media has enabled that. In my opinion, let's switch gears a little bit here. During your career, you spent, as we mentioned, a number of years at Justice Department. I first met you in the '80s when you were at the Office of Financial Enforcement at the Treasury, when early days, the Money Laundering Control Act of '86, the implementing regs after that, and sort of dealing with operational issues that the financial institutions had to grapple with and deal with, and that's how we first connected. You spent some time after DOJ in a bank, I believe it was Wells Fargo, and you obviously have left there, and now you're teaching and doing other things. My question revolves around back then when you were at Wells, not specific to Wells necessarily, but peer banks and others. What was the approach to white collar issues like corruption in terms of suspicious activity reporting and all that kind of? So sort of what was your focus back then? Because I know you were involved in that. And then what is your educated guess that banks are grappling with now, because there's this view that there's been this emphasis on deregulation from a regulatory standpoint, but there's also been all of what you've talked about in terms of pardons, sort of targeted prosecutions, not general prosecutions. So what was it like back then? Again, you and your colleagues, I'm sure you had roundtables and you exchange information. And what's happening now? And then I'll ask you later, how do we sort of get back to where you were at that time? But talk a bit about your time in the private sector and what you learned from that. Because I will tell you this, a lot of my friends like yourself, who went from public to private sector, were amazed at, and I'm not going to make this a negative, but what they didn't know, and they got to the financial institution, they learned a lot more, and that helped them better understand the breadth of AML and sanctions and all that good stuff. So, long-winded way of saying, what was it like when you first joined the bank, and what did you learn during that time in the space regarding anti-corruption and anti-bribery?
Sure. So I think in many respects, I was fortunate to have, when I came into Wells in the start of 2015, um, bosses above me who already had established a really strong framework, not just organizationally, but in terms of information resources, that made it really very possible to look at new methods, for example, we could use for reviewing transactions, reviewing activity, and so on. First of all, I have to cite Jim Richards, who is, as they said in the private sector, my two-up boss, the person who headed the whole financial crimes risk management program. First of all, as you know, Jim is more than a genius at these issues. He's had decades and decades of experience, and he was very attentive to all the fine details associated with understanding how money laundering works. I remember in my final interview before I got hired, I was talking with Jim, and he mentioned my work on the President's Commission on Organized Crime, where I was the main author of the 1984 report on money laundering, which led to—
I remember that report. Before. That got me involved in this, by the way, but go ahead.
Right. Well, it led, among other things, to the actual enactment, first time ever, of federal money laundering criminal offenses, but also I would say, the invigoration of the AML BSA program at Treasury. So Jim and I are talking, and there's some mention about what we'd done as a commission. We'd had a bunch of hearings, and we'd had various reports. And he said, "Oh, yes, I've read them." Now, when he said them, he meant all 9 hearing transcripts plus the multiple reports, which, if I spread my arms apart like this, that much information that he read to really understand and amass what this commission was doing, what it had to offer, and what it was showing that would be important from a regulatory perspective and compliance perspective. And then the other thing that I'll say, particularly about what I walked into at Wells, was the fact that there was this integrated financial crimes risk management program separate from the general counsel's office. I know that in smaller enterprises, it still may make sense to have one person wear a couple of hats, the legal hat, the compliance hat. But I think when you have really large-scale financial institutions like a Wells or other top-tier institutions, if you're going to have an effective compliance approach, an effective compliance program, you shouldn't be relying on the legal department to do that. I mean, all my dealings with the legal department at Wells were very, very positive, very productive, collaborative, and so on. But you have to have a somewhat different mindset when it comes to compliance, because you're not advising people, well, this is what the law says. You're saying, here's what we need to do to make our system, our compliance program, work more effectively. So what that also did, by the way, is because Wells was so large, I could focus just on anti-bribery and anti-corruption. They had other people who were experts on AML BSA issues, on sanctions, identity theft, but all kind of at the same level under Jim's, larger aegis, so that we could talk regularly, share information, and there was no competitiveness about that. It's like, okay, I've got a lane, there are areas where I can see we're overlapping with or have interest in your area too, but, none of that kind of sort of possible backbiting or turf consciousness or whatever. So all of that was very much in place. I think the other thing that I have to say is that, although it's unfortunate, Wells during the same period that I was there also went through the fake account scandal,
right?
Which was really not at all within financial crimes risk management's purview. that was a whole host of terrible decisions and reprehensible actions, I'll just say, by other people on the
Sure.
business side. But what it also helped us to do indirectly was to, when we're doing our compliance training and so on, we could say in so many words, you see what happened over there? That's why we need to have sound compliance in our lane. Here are the consequences if you don't have appropriate oversight, appropriate tracking of what's going on. So in many ways, I feel like I wasn't lacking for resources in any sense or commitment on the part of people above me. The key thing was seeing, and this really was a first time experience for me. How do you effectively carry out your mandate to oversee a global anti-bribery and anti-corruption program in a global enterprise that had, at that time, maybe on the order of 270,000 people globally?
Right.
That was, trying to get your arms around that massive responsibility and to have this work effectively. And I should add, to make sure that at first line level, you had people who got the message, whom you could trust, who you could say, okay, you're the front line. You can do these things. Like I'm giving you the basic criteria. Here's the guidance, but you, the folks who have eyes on the situation more quickly than anybody. So I'm not here to second guess you. I'm not here to jump over you and say, why didn't you do this or that? It's more a matter of establishing the right balance in terms of expectations and competence so that you can say, okay, first line does what first line needs to do. I'm second line at corporate level. I need to do that. But then also having an effective relationship with the auditors as third line so that nobody felt like we were either overstepping our bounds or not doing enough. So broadly speaking, I think I had a great experience to come into a global financial institution that already had, with the sad exception of the of what happened with the fake account scandal,
Fake accounts.
a basic commitment to just doing things the right way. Not trying to be overly pessimistic about whether business people are doing the right thing or not. The last thing I'll say, and I'll stop here. Right at the end of my tenure at Wells, I'll just say one of the things we did, and this is my office pushing it, we want to have a greater line of sight into a particular category of activity that traditionally hadn't been part of what you'd consider an AML BSA, or I should say, not just AML BSA, but anti-corruption function. And because this was sort of a prerogative that was reserved just to very senior officers, when I said, well, we just need to have information about what's happening here, who these people are, I got some pushback. And they said, why do you need to know this? I mean, not out of any improper motives, but just what are you doing in this space? Why do you need to know? Eventually, a call came into our office from the CEO who said, and personally, it wasn't like, somebody who delegated, he said, I understand why you want to do this, and that's fine. I get why you need to have oversight in this because of the sensitivities that could be associated with this kind of activity. So, long story short, I think one of the things that I was able to succeed at in different ways, I think, was to sort of establish that right balance where people think, yeah, you're not neglecting your duties and you're not overstepping your bounds. You're doing things that are in the interest of the enterprise, keeping keeping itself out of difficulties, having a strong basis in which to say, should any of our primary regulators say, why are you doing this or what are you doing about that, to be able to have answers where we can immediately tick off what we're doing and why. And they seem to be happy with those results.
So if you were there now, not Wells per se, but at a large financial institution, you have a couple of challenges you didn't have back then. One is the clear move toward deregulation, the lack of any sort of strong formal criticisms by regulators, which we're not sure yet because the exam process really hasn't completed for institutions to say, yes, it's vastly different than it was during the previous administration, but that's the speculation. With the executive orders on debanking, that my words seem to suggest you need to bank everybody and not make any decisions based on reputation. They use reputation in a pejorative sense, and I know that many FIs didn't think of it that way at all. But given all of that, and given what you said up front in the beginning of our conversation regarding the move, the massive move toward corrupt activities that seem to not be any sort of accountability. If you're at a financial institution today, given all of that, and given what I suspect will be some boards that may suggest we don't need the same resource allocation in compliance and investigations that perhaps we did before, that conversation I'm sure is happening. AI, another issue we can obviously talk about forever, but we'll leave that for another time. Given all of that, if somebody calls you and said, John, we want some advice and counsel about where we stand today, given the environment you just talked about, and how we as AML professionals in a financial institution should be reacting. So again, obviously institutions differ in terms of product line, all that kind of stuff. But just in general, I think you definitely would have thoughts on if you get called in, maybe to present to the board, to say they're bringing an outside lawyer to come in, talk to the board, someone who's been in a financial institution and has a broad experience you've had, and you're going to talk to them about bribery and corruption and what we broadly speaking should be doing. What are some of the things today you would advise?
Okay. I think there are a couple of things I would focus on first. Very early on in this administration, when, as you'll recall, the president made plain that he had no use for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He put a 6-month pause in, and subsequently the Department of Justice put out very detailed guidance that, to my way of thinking, having been a prosecutor, drastically changed the calculus that prosecutors are supposed to be using to look at whether cases that could involve FCPA violations should be pursued or not. The first thing that I know lots of law firms gave the same kind of advice when, some business people obviously think, oh, well, okay, school's out. You don't have to worry about that anymore. But law firms have had to say to their corporate clients, hang on now. The FCPA is still a fully operative statute with both criminal and civil sanctions associated with it. Yes, we see that the SEC has been less focused on FCPA and has kind of taken apart some of its own FCPA internal functions, but the law is still there. And folks, I need to remind you, for criminal statutes, it's a 5-year statute of limitations. So if you do anything today thinking school's out, we can do whatever we want, we'll send commissions, so-called, to foreign officials, the clock is going to start ticking from that point forward. And as I know you are also aware, in a bunch of these FCPA cases, the institutional practices got so deeply ingrained at some companies that they were paying bribes for years in multiple countries.
Right.
And so let's say at the most basic level, I think people have to be aware that the laws have not changed. The president's priorities may have changed enforcement. The Department of Justice has changed its efforts, although I will say in my former section, the fraud section of the Justice Department, they didn't do away with the FCPA unit. It's scaled down, but it is still operating, still doing casework. So I think you have to start with, this is a major area that if we don't pay attention to it, don't put appropriate resources on it, that can be, have major blowback effects to us, not this year, not next year, but down the road. And, if we have to review the bidding, when companies got tens of millions of dollars in contracts, but then they get $100 million or multiple $100 million fines and financial penalties, there's no value in that long term. So let's start with that. Now, what else do we have here? Okay, you have the whole BSA regulatory regime. I know how sensitive the debanking issue has become, how much attention this administration has focused on that because of what I would characterize as actually a fairly small handful of situations involving alleged discrimination based on religious affiliations or political affiliations. But under any circumstances, banks still have to be attentive to the basic BSA requirements, including customer due diligence obligations, and the fact that the CDD obligations don't end when you onboard somebody. They continue for the life of that relationship with that customer. So if I had to say anything, I would say, look, this may be an area where maybe we need to flag situations internally where if we think there's even a small possibility that somebody's going to object because we have been more critical of their bona fides as customers or whatever, maybe you have to do a little bit more digging to find facts that would allow you to say, no, we really need to unload this customer for any number of reasons. Banks, as you know, have always kept those kinds of decisions very, very close to the vest. And I have to say, in my estimation in the past, regulators hadn't been particularly helpful in saying, here are circumstances in which it's okay for you to terminate a customer relationship. But the reality is that this administration has focused on this issue of debanking. So I think that means in some respects, financial institutions are going to have to pay more attention to facts that provide them with a basis, a nonpartisan, neutral basis to say, no, this person really is too much of a risk to keep maintaining this person. Now, I'm well aware that this is a kind of one-off situation, but I have to say, in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, a lot of financial institutions ought to have been taking notice of what's now happened, not only in terms of fines against financial institutions because they continued to bank Epstein, but also more general lessons that kind of situation, those kinds of facts should prompt institutions to pay attention to, because you don't want to be the next bank that's somehow underwriting the next Epstein or supporting the next human trafficking organization or whatever. Does that mean that this administration is going to be harder on you in general in terms of compliance with BSA requirements, including CDD? No, I think it is a practical reality, however, that if you are identifying people who are, by any fair standard, creating risks that you are now continuing to bank somebody who's engaged in illegal activity, you may have to do more to gather evidence so that when your regulators come in the door saying, we think you're engaging in improper debanking, you're able to show them that this is not because of some animus for religious or social or political reasons, but this represents a real and substantial concern that this institution is continuing to bank somebody whose activities, if they came to public attention, could actually be a blowback for the administration of that particular bank. And frankly, that may also be necessary if some regulator says, well, we think you're improperly debanking people, we think you'd be subject to regulatory action. You need to have more facts at your disposal, not just a general, well, we're not sure, this person might be a little bit suspicious. To be able to say, here are the facts that we know. Here is the information that we have. We don't want to be continuing to bank somebody who, based on our own analysis, may be affiliated with a criminal group or engaging in other kinds of activities. And to a lesser extent, I saw this even when I was at Wells. If you can show your primary regulator, your examiners, like this isn't just some generic indisposition or animus against somebody. Here are facts. Here are things that give us reason to think that if we continue to bank this person, this will be a real risk to us, and we think we don't need to take that risk. even though there may be different political priorities that are being put on regulators, at the examiner level, at least I always found, if you're able to show examiners with particularity, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it in the way we're doing it, and this is how this responds to the concern you have. Even several years ago, when Wells wasn't held in the greatest esteem anymore by bank regulators, if you could provide specific, focused, factually based information that provides you a basis to say, this is why we chose to do this, I think that still can be a persuasive message at the regulator level.
John, appreciate you doing this. Let me get you out of here on this. First, I want to mention you have a Substack called Loyalty to Truth that's available. Also, people should connect with you on LinkedIn. You do with your folks at the American University a monthly roundup of anti-corruption and money laundering related documents and announcements and posts and cases, which is excellent, especially if you're into training, which is still so important regardless of what's happening. Given everything we've talked about, everything you've mentioned, the chaos that we're in now, and particularly in our world, the financial crime prevention world, are you still optimistic overall in terms of going forward? What's your take? I mean, you're teaching, you're obviously mentoring people, and I will tell you, I have a difficult time in the class that I teach, a graduate class I teach at George Mason, telling students, like a year or two ago, I would have said, government work is something you should actively consider in this space. A little harder to make that case now, although obviously I believe in that as an eventual goal. But as I've asked others, are you optimistic going forward?
Well, it's funny you ask in that way, John. Just last night, my wife and I were watching the second episode of The American Experiment, a new multi-part documentary that's really about the American Revolution and the American experiment, what made us unique in the world, in freeing ourselves of British rule and becoming an independent nation with a constitution of the type we have. If you ask George Washington, after he'd been chased across Long Island, chased out of New York, chased across New Jersey, and down to the very last ebb, before he was able to turn it around at the Battle of Trenton, are you optimistic that you're going to prevail? He would have said, probably. We have a mission. We have a responsibility to defend and fight for the people who believe in the cause of independence. So I would say I am hopeful, in part because the many legal challenges that have been brought, many of them with success against various excesses of the Trump administration. I am hopeful that, in fact, the worst decisions that have been made, the ones that are most characterizable as corrupt or unprincipled, can be put back on their heels, that there can be pushback. It is going to take time on the criminal side of enforcement for that to happen. I feel, and this is just my own personal perception, I feel like with all of these different political pressures that have been put on it, FinCEN has actually been in a pretty good position in terms of trying to continue to do its work in providing meaningful guidance to the regulated community. There are issues with which I might disagree with them where they're being responsive to political pressures in the administration. But I feel hopeful that with continued efforts for people who are not just part of the administration to continue to speak out, continue to say, this is inappropriate, this is downright unlawful, that, and even in instances where it may be within a regulatory agency's ambit to say, you're insisting on this, but there are bases on which what we want to do in terms of compliance are reasonable and rational and effective, that regulators on the financial institution side will be respectful of that, without in any way saying that they're going to suddenly ignore all of the precepts from the administration about debanking and supposedly new approach that financial institutions should be taking in looking at their customers. Bottom line is still, what is in the interest of any institution to safeguard its own name, reputation, and keep itself out of the headlines. And I think that means you still have to continue to do your job faithfully in complying with laws that are still on the books, both legislation and regulations that say you must do certain things. And all of that said, I think there are reasons for hope, but it's going to take continued and sustained pushback on the worst examples of corruption-related behavior or inappropriately regulation undermining behavior before I'll say I'm completely optimistic.
John Rusch, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. Really appreciate it. And as I said, we will put in the notes links to the Substack as well as your monthly roundup. But thank you for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
No, it's been my pleasure, John.